Good afternoon, everybody. We're now resuming after our lunch break. I hope you're all sugared up and ready for this last, almost last session, which is titled Mapping in the Digital World. And I think this morning we started looking at individual items and how this can be enhanced through digital methods. And here we will go up in scale and in a way in sort of complexity in some directions across different items. And we have three fantastic speakers. So our first speaker is Katherine McDonough. Katie is a lecturer at Lancaster University and also works as a senior research fellow at the Alan Turing Institute, where she's been working as part of the Living with Machines project and created and led the creation of a prize-winning platform, the Map Reader, and as part of a project that finished and kept going different ways, which was Machines Reading Maps. So she's really one of the people in the UK who are, and I think on a world stage, who are working on creative platforms, connecting maps in a bridging the digital and our collections in an interesting way. She's going to talk with us about map search using AI to explore map content. The floor is yours, Katherine.
It's really a pleasure to be here speaking with so many amazing colleagues, and I've learned so much this morning, and I hope to continue to learn this afternoon. So just to give you a little bit of context, I'm going to be speaking about the work that came out of two big collaborative projects. The first was Living with Machines, which has been mentioned. This was a project sort of co-located between the Alan Turing Institute and the British Library, which are conveniently both inside the British Library in London. And on that project, we were working primarily with Ordnance Survey maps from the National Library of Scotland. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. The work from Living with Machines is now continuing in a new project called Data Culture, which is also based at the Turing. The second project, Machines Reading Maps, was a spin-off of Living with Machines. And this was a collaboration between ourselves at the Turing, computer scientists in the Knowledge Computing Lab at the University of Minnesota, and the Digital Library at the University of Southern California, as well as our heritage partners at the British Library, the National Library of Scotland, and the Library of Congress. So as Giovanni mentioned, a lot of the work that we've been doing is thinking about what it means to work with these big digitized collections of maps that are coming into the world. On Living with Machines, we had a remit to use digitized collections, computational methods, to write new stories of industrialization in 19th century Britain. And so when I joined the project in 2019, which feels like a really long time ago now, before the pandemic, I was already working with maps, I was already working with spatial data, and what I was really drawn to was the kind of sort of obvious opportunity to think about industrialization in people's lives in the context of all the rich detail about industrial infrastructure and building sites that is present on Ordnance Survey maps from the 19th and early 20th century that have been amazingly digitized by the National Library of Scotland. And I do just want to emphasize how pioneering the work of the National Library of Scotland. I think many of you will be familiar with the work of Chris Fleet, and just how important the ways not only that he set about making collections available online, but thinking about what it meant to provide those collections at scale to researchers. And it's a pleasure to continue to work with Chris. And I think that working with him has really helped me learn about the kind of importance of, as we continue to do work with, as we now say, AI and digital collections, that there's no replacement for having strong relationships between the domain specialists, as machine learning people like to call us, historians, and library curators, librarians, as well as our colleagues, our data scientists and computer scientists and geographic information scientists. That kind of triad has already been mentioned today, and I just want to emphasize that. All right, so from that detail, we thought, okay, we have all these maps, they've been digitized. We know how to work with maps in this setting. This will be familiar to many of you. This is the British Library Maps Reading Room, where the kind of infrastructure for providing maps to the people who come into the reading room is really setting us up for using maps in certain ways in our research, right? So we can look at a few maps at a time. We can't order 15,000 maps. That's just not possible. And we have a scholarly tradition, therefore, of working with maps in small numbers. We use maps as evidence that's supported, evidence supporting arguments that are made primarily with textual sources. That's a really kind of common issue for historians working with maps. So this question was, okay, we have ways of working with maps. We feel like we could do more with maps, use them as evidence in new ways in historical scholarship. And we now have access to maps in new ways. So how do we go about doing this? And I just want to say this. So these are the maps that we use, first on Living with Machines, as well as in Machine 3D Maps. These are the 6-inch second edition OS maps. And our colleague Olivia Vane made this beautiful visualization that plots each sheet according to its survey date. So you can see here the kind of run of maps as they are surveyed over time. So we really kind of set ourselves this problem to solve, which was to think about how we can look at maps as data and to create methods that allow us both to work with one map, but also 10,000 maps, right? And to not kind of have a path dependency that would prevent us from moving around in that spectrum of scale. We wanted to make sure that we weren't treating maps as a ground truth, right? Maps are not everything that was on the ground, as has already been mentioned. And we are kind of well grounded in now is this idea that just as much as what is on the map, it's what is not on the map is historically important. And so we needed to think about how are we kind of bringing maps that have been scanned into a computational environment which doesn't equate them with the truth. We also wanted to think about how what we were doing with these maps was not just automating things that we were already doing, right? This is something I think in machine learning and AI land more generally, is this idea, well, okay, we just need to automate. Automation is another sort of verb that's very common in this field. And I thought, well, but we're already doing that. That's already a kind of a well-worn intellectual pathway. We trace roads in GIS, so we should automate the vectorization of road networks on maps. Well, maybe we can do something else. Maybe we can do something more creative that actually gets us to think differently about what maps are doing, their production practices, the way people look at them, and what we can learn about the societies and landscapes that they are depicting. And then finally, and incredibly importantly, we need to think about how the computational methods we're developing are supporting the responsible use of natural resources so that we're not just leaving virtual machines on and running HPCs endlessly to do experiments without this consideration. Okay, so our solution is this software library called MapReader. MapReader is now a pretty mature library. We have a few years of development under us. We've just published our Journal of Open Source Software paper on top of some earlier research papers for earlier versions of the pipeline. So MapReader is an open source piece of software. There's a number of people who have collaborated on MapReader, from myself, but also colleagues at the project. And I do just want to highlight Kazra Hosseini, who was the first developer. He was a data scientist with a background in geophysics at the Turing. And now we have Rosie Wood, who started out her academic life as a computational chemist and came to the Turing as a data scientist and has now been working on MapReader. And there's a number of other people who contribute and are really thinking about what it means to address those kind of concerns that I raised earlier. So the basic premise for the first kind of task that we set out to solve with MapReader was this idea of how do we kind of ask questions of maps, all right? So the idea that we had was we take one map sheet, we break it up into cells or regions, and this is a very common thing that people do in computer vision. We create those cells and regions, we call them patches. But for us, the idea was that the patch becomes our unit of analysis. The patch becomes the thing, this kind of visual space that we can ask questions of. As historians, as art historians, as historical geographers, right? Whoever is approaching the map can ask a question of this new piece of information. What CV task are we doing? For those in the room who are more or less familiar, this should help give you a kind of basic sense. What MapReader was and continues to be is not a representation of state-of-the-art computer vision. We are not trying to solve the latest and greatest computer vision problems. We want to apply things that make sense for the collections and the questions that we have. So what we're doing here is we're taking what is a quite kind of simple old CV task, which is just image classification. Image classification means that we're not defining on a pixel level what a thing is or where it is. We're simply saying in an image, is there a thing? And that thing or the label is defined by the user. But what we do, again, is we don't apply that to the whole map. We only ask that of the patch, right? So is something present in the patch? Is there a visual signal for a thing, a concept that I'm interested in that patch? So our first experiment with this method was to kind of think about a new way to create a data set about railway infrastructure in Britain. This being a really important element of the industrial landscape in the 19th century, we wanted to do more than just say, oh, we're going to create a network of railway tracks, for which there is already data created by the amazing CAMPOP project at Cambridge. But we wanted to think instead about, because we're interested in what it was like to live with machines, right? To experience the arrival and the impact of rail in a community, we wanted to capture what we call rail space as this total footprint of rail infrastructure. And so patches are the perfect vehicle for that, right? It's not precise. It's intentionally not as granular as a pixel, and it allows us to think about the rail in the landscape. So in order to use MapReader, as part of the MapReader pipeline, we have an annotation interface. So I annotated 62,000 patches. I said, this is rail space, this is not rail space. But from that 62,000, which we actually didn't need 62,000, but way back in 2020, we didn't know that yet. We inferred the presence of rail space or not on 30.5 million patches that were divided into, so to take all of those second edition maps and divide them into 100 by 100 meter patches, that's what you get. So as you can see here in kind of frame A, those are the sheet boundaries. B, we have the national, tri-national level sort of results, inference results. And then at C, you can see rail space in the gray and no rail space in the white on the level of one sheet. Now, this is what this looks like on a patch-by-patch basis. So you can see here, we would like to think about rail space in terms of its density. So we talk about dense and not dense rail space, but really you can think of these as kind of like urban and rural rail space. But you can really get a sense here of, this is really useful data for us understanding where rail is, what's next to rail, right? What is kind of going on in the vicinity of rail, and of thinking of rail as part of that kind of industrializing landscape. So what can you do with all of this? So we like to think of this as, okay, we take these patches and we combine them with other historical information, which is also geolocated. And this was one of the really exciting things we did on Living with Machines. We combined rail space patches with geolocated residential streets, the 1901 household census data, which was aggregated at the street level, which is a super exciting project that I don't have time to talk about, but my colleague Joshua Rhodes has an article coming out about this soon. And then the third data set was a geolocated passenger railway station data set. And so what this allows, again, to come back to this kind of thinking about scale, is we can have very local, regional, county level, city level, as well as national level views of the impact of rail infrastructure on people's lives. For Greater London, this is what this looks like when we put this data together. We can see in the black, we have rail space patches. And then from blue, yellow, orange into red, we have residential streets. And so we can see here in the orange and the red, streets that are very close to high density rail space. So then what we can do is we can grab those streets and look at the census data from those streets. What are the occupations of the people living on those streets close to rail infrastructure? And very importantly, what we're able to find that's kind of countering earlier historiography. A lot of the earlier historiography argues that class-based segregation increases in British cities when rail is introduced. Okay, this is true. However, what we can also pay attention to with this street level data and an understanding of the presence of rail infrastructure and not only tracks is that people who work in industries related to rail and manufacturing near docks, for example, where there's a lot of rail space, are living near there. And that's a choice that they're making. That's a positive choice, right? So very heavy rail space, which we might think is automatically something you don't want to live near. You don't want to live near the East India Docks or the West India Docks and the Isle of Dogs, where there's all that black space. But for people who work in those industries, it's an amenity. You want to live close to work, right? So it's kind of turning on its head for certain parts of British society, these older stories about the impact of industrialization. So there's lots of other applications. We've been having a lot of workshops. Some of the people in the room have been to our workshops where people are playing around with MapReader, using Ordnance Survey maps, using other kinds of maps, and doing all kinds of experiments to find historical information on maps. Now, what's really cool, and I'm going to end with, is saying that, well, we're not just looking at patches. We're also able to find text on maps. So this was the Machines Reading Maps project, was focused on text. What really excited me as a historian, as someone who is interested in cartography from a historian's perspective, is that we've been talking about reading maps for a really long time. We've been talking about maps as text for a really long time, but we haven't actually had approaches or a lot of scholarship that sits and reads the text on maps. So that's what we're able to do now. We're able to create data sets of text on maps. A lot of you will be familiar with one of the data sets that we created on Machines Reading Maps in collaboration with the Rumsey Collection at Stanford. As of last week, you can now search the entire Rumsey collection based on the text found on those maps. It's a huge amount of information. It looks like this when you put it on a map. And this is the kind of thing that is really a new historical data set for us to figure out how to work with, right? What do we do with this much information? That's what I'm working on right now. That's what I'm really excited about. So MapReader allows people to create this data themselves. You can find patches, you can find text, you can do all kinds of things with those data sets. You can count the words on map sheets. You can compare how words are different on maps of the same area over time. What words are at the center of the map? What words are at the edge? Can we collect metadata for uncatalogued collections with this technique? There's all kinds of things that we can do. I'm just going to super quickly wrap up with an example that bridges patches and text. So here we can see, I think this is Glasgow, yeah, I believe. So the purple patches are where there are buildings, the yellow patches, there are no buildings. Here we've identified the text that is overlapping with a building patch. So in the yellow, we have the polygons, right, surrounding a text that are ostensibly naming a building because they're overlapping with a patch that contains a building. And the purple are texts that do not overlap with the building. And then we can do things like look at what is the text that is least probable to overlap with the building patch. And we start to see the kinds of labels on Ordnance Survey maps that occur in rural areas. And we can measure these. Now, what if we could do that over the entire nation, right? This is just one sheet. And if we can do that across time, from the first edition to the second edition, et cetera. Just to wrap up, say, why should we search inside maps and how should we do it? We can find lost place names and place name variations. We can look at how environments are changing, both the built and the natural environment. We can find evidence of unique but lost communities. In our collaboration with the Library of Congress, we were working with Sanborn fire insurance maps, and we found all kinds of information that actually struck us as a really important way to document the presence of historical Chinatowns and Koreatowns and Japantowns in US cities in the 19th and 20th century. And finally, finally, I say this all the time because I find it really exciting as a historian who was trained to go to archives and write case studies, we can move around in scale, right? We can compare local case study arguments with what we can now begin to look at in terms of very high resolution information at a regional, national, and even transnational scale or global scale, right, with the Rumsey collection. So I think just to end, I think what's really important is that we're doing all this within the context of a deep understanding of mapping practices. We want to collect the data that our questions need and that our sources can provide, and thinking about how we work with computer vision, machine learning, and AI more broadly is really important, that we kind of do that as a conversation, and that we're not just saying, what's the latest and greatest shiny thing out there in AI world that we can bring in to analyze maps without having that historical context and collecting context behind it. If you want to learn more, we have a lot of publications. There's a new chapter out in a cool book called Computational Humanities, and the information on the detail kind of about the census work with streets and rail spaces in the Living with Machines book, which is starting to be published online, but will be in print next year. That piece is called Beyond the Tracks. Thank you very much.